he's casting himself as the sort of the peacenik, if you like, surprisingly enough. That's not to say that all these demonstrators will necessarily go and vote for Donald Trump. But it might mean that they don't vote for Joe Biden. I think unless the administration, the police, university officials can put a stop to some of these protests and fairly soon, it could be a real political sticking point for Biden as the rest of the year unfolds.
Now, we should probably talk. We'll obviously come to politics and the race of the White House in a moment, but we should talk about these protests. Extraordinary pictures emerging from pro-Palestinian protests at universities across America. Police in Los Angeles begin moving in to demonstration at the University of California. And I think we can actually hear officers have been using flashbangs designed to disorientate activists as they move in. Let's hear a bit of what's been going on. So, Alistair, this isn't gunfire. This is just police tactics to sort of confuse students.
These are very safe, actually. Things that the police use. It's, as you say, they're used all over the world in demonstrations to disorientate and to confuse. But it sounds like a war zone, and that's not really what Joe Biden wants on the streets of the US. And it just shows, I think, not only what a problem these protests are for him, but also the fact that his powers of persuasion, his powers of negotiation aren't working, or the administration's aren't, and it seems that the police are being sent in now, as it shows there, live at UCLA, but also at Columbia University in New York 2 days ago, to come and dismantle some of these pro-Palestinian protests that we've seen at scores of universities across the US.
On what grounds are they breaking them up? What are the students doing? And is there a risk that this sort of pretty heavy-handed police response actually ends up fueling more similar demonstrations?
Well, the protesters' argument is very simple. They are exercising their First Amendment rights, the right to free speech and to demonstrate. They're all at university, and that's where they've chosen to do it, and they're not breaking the law. What their opponents, the police, the administration, many members of Congress say is that these demonstrations are violent. They are trespassing because a lot of people involved in them aren't actually students at these universities. And I think most importantly of all, they're nakedly anti-Semitic, and they're intimidating to Jewish members of the community. Some of the signs are very anti-Semitic, and they're stopping the universities from conducting their normal business, which is the teaching of students and learning.
I mean, what's the political impact of this? I mean, we've talked before about how young people traditionally more likely to back the Democrats and then Joe Biden. But I mean, we saw, even there were protests of him, Joe Biden, when he turned up at the White House Correspondents' dinner at the weekend.
That's right.
So is this actually an issue where Joe Biden and Donald Trump are on the same page?
No, not at all, really. And there are lessons from history for Joe Biden. If you go back to 1968, the Vietnam War was in the full throw of it's probably one of its most violent periods. Hubert Humphrey, who was the vice president, won the Democratic nomination for the presidency to take on Richard Nixon. And young people protesting against the Vietnam War, cast him as a warmonger. When they went to the Democratic Convention in Chicago, there were pitched battles between demonstrators and the police, tear gas, and people beaten up, and hundreds of people arrested. And that idea of Hubert Humphrey being a warmonger stuck. Nixon, on the other hand, said, "Look, I've got a plan to end the war, and I will end the war." Nixon won the election, and of course, the war didn't end for another 7 years. After which Nixon had resigned from office. But you look at what Donald Trump said. Donald Trump, he talks about the Ukraine war. I'll stop the war within 24 hours. He talks about the Israel-Gaza war. He says, it will come to an end because I'll persuade Israel to stop the war. So he's casting himself as the sort of the peacenik, if you like, surprisingly enough. That's not to say that all these demonstrators will necessarily go and vote for Donald Trump. But it might mean that they don't vote for Joe Biden. I think unless the administration, the police, university officials can put a stop to some of these protests and fairly soon, it could be a real political sticking point for Biden as the rest of the year unfolds.
Is it actually just a result of Joe Biden's sort of slightly steadier, reasonable on the one hand, on the other, taking it all in the round and trying to, maintain his loyalty to Israel while also seeking to bring an end to this conflict? That actually, in an increasingly angry, polarized politics, it just doesn't resonate. There's a risk he doesn't resonate with anyone.
Right, exactly. So on the one hand, Joe Biden talks about having an ironclad commitment to Israel's security. And that means that when Iran attacks, US forces are involved in shooting down some of the drones and missiles that are fired. He's also very critical of Israel's conduct of the war and saying that more humanitarian aid should be getting in, and that the offensive that's long been planned by the Israelis in Rafah shouldn't go ahead. But you're right, he's got this sort of almost diplomatic approach to it, this reasonableness, this idea that the war has to go through the various phases. But it's now 6 months old, and a lot of these protesters who are, as I say, avowedly pro-Palestinian in their protest, think that Joe Biden is assisting Israel and that he is. That he's elongating the war. He's making the situation in Gaza much worse by his support for Israel.
More broadly, then, looking more broadly at the sort of the political picture, Alistair, we've talked before about the role of Mike Johnson as Speaker in the House of Representatives. He famously didn't meet David Cameron. David Cameron was there to try and encourage the US to pass its Ukraine support bill, but they then did. So, one way or another, it happened. But now there's calls for him to be removed.
Calls by Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a right-wing member of Congress from Georgia. She was very much against this bill of aid for Ukraine, $61 billion for Ukraine, but part of a much broader package worth about $90 billion, which includes some money for Israel as well. She has promised to use her influence, and the Republicans only have a very tiny majority in the House, to try and bring next week what's called a motion to vacate, which is essentially to kick out the Speaker. She's very angry with him. I think, though, she is seen as increasingly a marginal figure. She's very close to Donald Trump, but even Donald Trump has said that Mike Johnson's done a good job. The Democrats in the House, who Mike Johnson will need, even if just 3 or 4 Republicans side with Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Democrats have said that they'll support Mike Johnson as well. I mean, what it says is that Mike Johnson, I think, is actually in a stronger position than he was before the Ukraine package was put to a vote. But it also shows that there are these elected members of Congress, especially the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are there simply to disrupt and to force agenda, which is bordering on the conspiracy theorist and the sort of somewhat deranged, some people might say.
And finally, Alistair, Joe Biden on drugs.
Yes, maybe everyone should just smoke a joint and everyone would be a bit happier. But cannabis,
just calm down.
Cannabis here in the US, at a federal level at least, is categorised in the same, what they call schedule, as heroin, as some really hard, as we would call them, Class A drugs. Cannabis is going to be downgraded to a Schedule 3 drug, essentially like anabolic steroids you might take to get pumped up in the gym. I think it's for 3 reasons he's doing this. One, the cannabis market is worth billions and billions of dollars now. And I think by downgrading cannabis to Schedule 3, it allows greater research, it allows greater use medicinally, and that will boost that market. It also helps with younger voters as well. I mean, we've just spoken about how younger voters are angry with him over the war in Gaza. Younger voters are the ones that are most likely to get arrested for smoking joints in the street. I think that's less likely to happen now. It doesn't actually make the recreational use of cannabis legal, but I think it's certainly a message to voters and to law enforcement that cannabis really isn't something they're going to be taking terribly seriously at a federal level.
Well, and anyone who's been to America, many states in America over the last couple of years, will be only too aware that cannabis is not taken very seriously by the authorities. Alistair, lovely to speak to you. Get out and enjoy the sunshine.